Hello, it's Simon Zucchi here, and in this property education video, I'm going to talk about why it's no longer profitable to be a landlord for most people. Now, this might seem strange. You might expect me to be talking about why property is so amazing as a property educator, encouraging people to get into property. But the reality is that for many, many landlords, it's just not profitable to be in property, or at least it's not as profitable as it used to be. So we're going to look at this and understand why are so many landlords selling up, and what does this mean for you, whether you are a potential investor, a current investor, a tenant. What's the impact of all of this? I'm sure you've heard very recently in the news, there have been some reports that are saying that rents have shot up massively over the last couple of years. It's really hard for people to find good quality accommodation at an affordable rate. And one of the reasons that's happened is because many landlords are selling. And one of the reasons they're selling is because it's just not as profitable as it used to be. So why is that the case? Despite these rising rents, why does it still not work for most landlords? Well, there are two things you need to understand. First of all, most people who have investment properties, typically they own those in their own name. And when the Conservative government in April 2017 introduced Section 24, this was a change to the way that we as property investors are taxed. They said if you own property in your own name, which the vast majority of property investors did, and you had a mortgage on the property, which most investors have, and you're a high rate taxpayer, which not all but many property investors are, they said you can no longer offset all of the interest against the rental income to reduce your profit. Now, they introduced this in 2017, phased over 4 years, and to be honest, most people didn't really feel the effect of it. And the reason they didn't notice was because for about a decade, the Bank of England base rate was only 0.5%. What that meant was most buy-to-let landlords were paying about 2.5–3% on the mortgage because they had an interest rate that was base rate, i.e. 0.5%, plus maybe 1.5%, 2% or 3%. So in other words, they were making really good cash flow on their properties and they didn't really notice the extra tax slowly coming in from Section 24. But then in February 2022, the Bank of England started to raise the Bank of England base rate. And that was because we had such high inflation that was caused because of COVID a couple of years before. So as the Bank of England raised their interest rates to try and control inflation, the direct effect on people who have variable rate mortgages is the cost of their monthly mortgage goes up. Now, the way Section 24 is calculated, you could have a landlord who's not actually making any cash flow. In other words, because the interest rates have gone up, you had some landlords where the cost of their mortgage was more than they were renting out the property for. So it was actually costing them money every single month to have that tenant in place. However, because the way the tax is calculated has changed, on paper, those landlords were making a phantom profit. So at the end of the year, not only had they made no money, they had to subsidize their property, they were then having to dig in their pocket and pay some tax to the taxman. There's only a certain number of years you're prepared to do that. Now you might think, well, surely all those landlords just raised their rent. And here's something you need to understand. When you have a really good tenant in the property and you want to look after that property and that tenant, many landlords do not raise the rent every year as maybe they should, as rents and inflation go up. You see, if you raise it too much and the tenant moves out, and we don't want to evict anyone, we want to keep them living in it, give them a good home. But if it's too much and they move out, you're then going to have what's called a void period. That's the gap between tenants when you've got to pay for the mortgage, you've got to pay for the council tax, the standing charge on the gas, the electric, etc. And most people, they get into property to create cash flow, to generate cash flow, not to have to pay for their property every single month. So if you have these void periods, and then if you've got to get a letting agent to get a new tenant in, you're going to pay a fee for that. So most landlords have worked out that it's better to leave the rent nice and low and not upset the tenant and risk them leaving, rather than have these void periods. And even if you have a higher rent with a new tenant, you might actually make less money. And that's always the way it's been. So people get into habits. And so landlords are used to keeping rents pretty similar for good tenants. And only when the tenant moves out do they then raise the rents. However, That's not the way to make money. And at the end of the day, we need to recognize supply and demand. The fact is, especially during COVID and since COVID, there's been a real shortage of good quality accommodation. And so as a landlord, really, you should be raising your rents. And we got to the point where inflation was double digit. Back in 2021 and into 22, we had double digit inflation, which is the cost of living going up. So your rent should have also gone up. Now, the Labour government are bringing in a policy as part of the Renters' Rights Bill, where they're saying that landlords cannot put up the rent more than 10% a year. Now, actually, I don't think that's such a bad thing. I don't think that's something to worry about, because I very much doubt most landlords actually do that. However, what this means is there is a window of opportunity. Before that legislation comes in, you need to increase the rents on your property, particularly if your tenant has been benefiting from relatively low rates for a long period of time. Now, of course, we want to be sensitive. We want to think about affordability, and we can't jump up the rents too much. But you definitely should be having a conversation with your tenants if you've not had enough of a rent increase to make them realize that actually everywhere else has gone up. If they went somewhere else, they'd probably be paying more rent than they're paying you anyway. So it's not about us exploiting people. It's just trying to make sure that we are recompensed for the investment we're making, the fact we're providing good quality accommodation, which is what you should be doing. And unfortunately, not all landlords do that. Sometimes landlords get a bad name, but a very small minority of bad landlords who don't look after their properties, who are not looking after tenants. And we don't teach you to be like that. We want to teach you to be a great landlord, looking after your property and looking after tenants. And there's got to be a fair exchange. If you're providing good quality accommodation, the tenant needs to respect that and be able to pay for that so that you can make money. After all, this is a business. And it's amazing how sometimes people think, well, I should get to rent for free. Why should I have to pay? Well, why should someone live for free? If you went to work for someone, would you expect to work for them for free? No, you expect to be rewarded for your time and effort putting in. And so I think it's important to recognize that there's a supply and demand, and as landlords, we should be providing good quality accommodation. But for most people, because they've not raised the rents, because we've had an increase in interest rates, and because we've got Section 24 in full effect right now, that's why for many, many landlords, it no longer works to be a property owner. And that's why we're seeing so many landlords sell up. I'm not saying you should sell and get rid of your old properties, far from it. In fact, I was selling a few properties during the boom in COVID. I'm actually buying a lot of property right now and for the next couple of years. And as a landlord, as a property owner, here's what you can do. As and when your tenants do move out, you should think about, can I repurpose this property? Can I use it in a different way? Maybe it's a single let property that could be used as serviced accommodation, but we rent it out short term for a much higher rent. Now, it's not full all the time. We want to aim for about a 70% occupation rate, but we might get a much more rent, and it's a really good demand for that at the moment. Be aware, regulation is coming to the world of SA in England. I think it will scare off lots of amateurs. And whilst there is a little bit of an oversupply in service accommodation right now, I think when that regulation comes in, there'll be less supply, still a good demand, which means that rates will go up. The other strategy, which is one of my favorites, is obviously HMOs, houses of multiple occupation. That's where you're renting out individual rooms to students or young professionals, etc. You include all the bills. It's a very cost-effective way for them to live in your property where the bills are included. It's much cheaper than if they're living on their own in a studio or one-bed apartment, where as well as the rent, they'd have to pay all the bills. So it's cost-effective for the tenants. If you create a high-end co-living, it's not just about renting a room in a house, they're becoming part of a community, and often they don't want to leave, and actually they're prepared to pay a higher rent because they've got this great community feel. They're living with like-minded people. So actually, high-end HMOs is definitely the way to go, particularly in 2025, where there is a lot of competition for very average HMOs. Please don't do average HMOs. Most of them are very boring, not great condition. We want providing really fantastic quality accommodation for those tenants who are slightly more discerning and prepared to pay for that better quality. So that's how a normal landlord can maybe repurpose their property and increase the amount of income they make, and so make it far more profitable. Now, with all these landlords exiting the market, selling up and retiring, if you're new to property, you might think, well, hang on a minute, is it still worth getting in? What you also need to understand is this. Remember, most of those people who had properties were in their own names and they were affected by Section 24. At the moment, if you buy a property within a company structure, you're not affected by Section 24. So we can have exactly the same property with the same rental income coming in. The original landlord owns it in their own name. You own that property in a company name and you will make more money than they will because you're in a better tax position. So you need to understand this. It's not just about the property, it's about the structure in which you do it. In fact, company is probably the best way. I'm going to be doing a video in a few weeks about should you be buying in a company or individual. For most people, buying in a company is probably the best way moving forward. However, this is not meant to be tax advice, it's education to get you thinking in a new, different way. So whilst it doesn't work for many people, it's not as profitable as it used to be. If you know what you're doing, if you use some slightly more advanced strategies, you can still make a lot of money in property, providing really good, affordable accommodation for people who cannot afford to buy. And that's what we're doing. We're providing a great service and we're getting rewarded well for that. So I do hope you've liked this. Come and comment below. What do you think? Do you think it's no longer worth being a landlord? Or can you see there's a huge opportunity because so many landlords are selling up and getting out, which means there's going to be less supply and thus rents are probably going to go up even more. So I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, come and subscribe and hit the bell icon to make sure you get notified anytime we bring out a brand new video. Until the next video, I encourage you to always invest with knowledge, invest with skill.